Welcome to the Flex Rental Solutions webinar. Today we're going to be talking about the contact associations area in the project element settings. To get here, we go to Projects, Project Elements, and let's look at the quote since this is the more frequently used element in Flex. And then we'll go to the Contact Associations tab. The first thing that you'll probably notice is that the contact associations that are enabled are ones that you see when you create a new quote. So here we can see the account manager, which is the responsible person, and the caption is account manager. The business location is warehouse, and then we also have client and the venue/site. So you can enable any of these contact associations to appear on the edit header screen when you create a new quote. So for example, if you like to list the technical director and maybe a project manager, then you can just click yes to enable each of those. Then click update. And now when you go to create a new quote, then you'll see those two contact associations as options now. The required field is just a simple matter of if it says yes, then that particular contact association will turn red on the create new quote screen, and it won't let you get past until you actually select something in that field. So if I go back to create a new quote, you can see that the client field is now red because I set that as required yes. So let me select some dates. And if I try to click accept without choosing a client, then it will say please correct invalid fields, and I'll have to choose a client before I can actually accept and create the quote. As far as let me just go back to that, the date and time, the ship date time and the return date and time, that one is required as well by default, and that one is changed on the dates and times tab of the project element settings. And you would just change start date required yes or no, and end date required yes or no, then click update. So back to the contact associations, you can change the caption for any of these. So if you call maybe your responsible person, if you call it something different than account manager, then you can just simply override what the caption is. Or maybe you just want this to be called location instead of warehouse. These are just the defaults that are set up, but we leave that pretty customizable because we know that each company might call it something different, and we want their contact associations to work with how their company works. And you can change that for any of these here. The type restriction is a resource type restriction for each of the association types. So for example, the only two that you see that are restricted right now are the responsible person, which is restricted to an employee type, because typically when you're creating a new quote, the responsible person or account manager is one of your employees. So by default, we've restricted that to an employee type. And same with the business location, we have restricted that to a warehouse. So you can only choose from your warehouses that you have set up in your system. And that's because you can only choose a warehouse for your business location because this is how your conflicts are going to be calculated, is based on the location and the availability of that gear from that location. You can see the other ones are not restricted, but you can restrict them if you want. So for example, right now, you could choose the project manager from any of your contact resource types. It could be a client, it could be freelance, it could be an employee. But if your company only uses your employees as project managers, then you can restrict that. So you just choose that and click update. And now you could only choose a project manager from your employee's resource type. Let me just switch that back. We'll look at the inherited and override enabled in just a minute, but I just want to look at the email template and user default really quick. You can see that the email template really only applies to the client and vendor right now. And for the quote, it doesn't apply to the vendor at all because we don't use a vendor on the quotes. So for example, if we were to go to the project element settings for a purchase PO, and if we look at the contact associations tab there, the vendor is enabled and the email template is email PDF to vendor template. So again, you don't necessarily use a vendor on your quotes, so that's not enabled, and we have the email template as none. But the client email template is the send to client template, which is pulled from your projects menu and email templates. And these are the templates that are sent when you're on a quote and you click send to client and it pops up that email template. That's where that information is coming from, is from your email templates here. So what you can do is create a new email template. And then after you've created that and given it a name, then you can choose that new email template from this list here. And that would be the email template that gets sent when you click send to client from the quote. So a real use case scenario of this might be, maybe you just keep this as the send to client template, but then you can see that we have an email template for send to invoice to client. So when you open the invoice project element settings, and we go to the contact associations, then you can see that that is a different email template. And so maybe if you've set up an entire element, a custom element in your system, then you might have set up a custom email template that only applies to that element. And then the user default, you'll recall that when you set up users in your system, to properly do it, you also have to set up an employee contact. So for example, we set up a user in this system for myself, but then we also set up an employee contact. And on the Terms and Notes tab, we associate my user ID with the employee contact. And from here, you can also assign a home base and a corporate identity. But what happens here is that when you have user default set to yes for one of these rows, then what happens is that that information will automatically be filled based on the user default settings right here in the Terms and Notes tab of their contact entry. So for example, you can see that business location and responsible person are set to user default yes. So when I go to create a new quote, it automatically fills in my name and it automatically fills in my home base location. These are set to default yes when you receive a new Flex system. These are set to yes because typically you always want an account manager and you always want a business location. And typically it's going to be the default for the person who's currently logged in. So obviously you can change that. You could say these are not user default. And so now when you go to create a new quote, these just come up blank and you'll have to choose one each time you create a new quote. But I would say 95% or more of the time, you're just going to want that to default to the current user that's logged in. So you don't have to choose it every time. And the last thing that we'll look at is the inherited and override enabled. This works when you are creating this element as a child from a parent. So for example, we're looking at the quote options right now. And typically one way that you would create a quote as a child would be from an event folder. So I created an event folder beforehand. The account manager is myself. The client is Chris Stein. The venue is at Energy Solutions Arena. And if we look at the header settings, you could see that the location is the Orem warehouse. Going back and looking at the settings on the contact associations, you can see that each of these are inherited. So the account manager, warehouse, client, and venue site will all be inherited from a parent when I create a quote as a child. So if we go back to the event folder and from the Add Child Elements menu, choose Add Quote, then all of that information has automatically been inherited to the quote since it's a child of the event folder. So I could go back and say, maybe I don't want the client to inherit every time, because maybe you have an overarching event, but each quote might have a different client who's part of that company. And maybe the venue as well. Maybe you're having it at a convention center, but you want to put the venue as each individual room instead of just the entire convention center as a whole. So you would set those as inherited to no, so that even though this has a venue and site and a client, whenever I add a new quote to the event folder, those do not inherit, and I would have to input them manually each time I create a new child quote to that event folder. Let's go back to the settings really quick and put inherit back to yes for client and venue. And then this time I want to show you what override enable does. And this works with the parent-child relationships that we're just talking about. So if I were to set override enabled to no for all of these that are inheriting from the parent, let me show you what happens. Always remember to click update after you make any of those changes. So if we go back to our event folder, add a new quote, you can see that it's inherited the information from the parent, but I cannot edit it. So that's what the override enabled set to no does. And then you also have a little indication here telling you where it was inherited from. And this works if I go and create the entire quote, then the inability to inherit, the inability to override will carry over to the header. And if you go to edit header on the quote, you still won't be able to override. So let's go back and I will reset these to override enabled yes. And the very last thing that we want to look at is that you can use these association types in both the document header and in your document views. So by default, these are already set up to do that. If we look at our document views for working view, for example, and our header block columns, you can see the account manager. And in this one, it looks like we don't have the warehouse is right there. I'm sorry. So we have the account manager and the warehouse. But let's say, for example, if we enable another one of these association types, and let's do the bill to. A working scenario for this would be maybe you have a client who is your contact and the person that you're working with, but you want to bill the job to either the parent company that they work for or a completely different client or company. So you would enable the bill to field so that you can actually, we also have to add the caption, my mistake. And we'll just call it bill to. So now when we create a new quote, we will see the bill to field where I could enter a separate client or contact. But I can also make that bill to appear in our document header. Remember, the document header is going to be the large blocks that appear at the very top of your quote document. And so by default, you typically have the client and the venue site set up. But for this one, we also previously set up the bill to be the center address caption. And we chose the address source as the bill to address. And so basically what this will do is the contact that you put into the bill to contact field or the contact association field, it will take their address and put it into the center address caption. So let me update all the settings there and let's show how this will look. We'll create a new quote. Let's choose the client as Chris. But we don't necessarily want to bill Chris himself. We just want to bill Flex. So let's choose Flex as the bill to. Oops, I need to choose dates. And so now you'll see that that new bill to field will show up in the middle here because we set it up in our document header. And you have a total of 6 document header blocks that you can use. And you can also use your contact associations in your document views. So for example, we enabled the technical director and the project manager. So let's go back to our document views and look at our working view. And we could add to the header block. And let's put it on the last row, so 2. And let's say we want to add the technical director. And then you could choose the technical director from the field type. Once you've enabled a contact association, then it will show up in the field types here. And we'll give it a width factor of 1. Click plus, it will add it here. And remember, when we're updating document views, you have to update the document view window, and then you have to update the project element settings as a whole. And so if we go back and let's reopen this quote, then we see the technical director field here in the header block. So just as a quick review, each association type can be enabled or disabled. And when you enable them, you will see them on the edit header window when you're creating a new quote or editing a quote. And also when you enable them, you can use them either on the document header or in your document views. The caption is the caption that will appear when you're creating a new quote. Required yes or no will give you that red box around the association type, and it won't let you push forward until you select one if it's required. The user default will choose the user default from the contact entry and automatically fill those in. And the inherited and override enabled has to do with when you're creating this element as a child from a parent and whether or not it will inherit the attributes from the parent. We also have a default business location. Since we've enabled the business location here, you can also set up a default business location that will always be the business location when you create a new quote. But this will be overridden by the user default settings. So for example, if a user that doesn't have a business location set up for them by default, if you had a business location set here, then the quote would defer to this default business location. But if their business location default was different from this one, then it would go to the user default first. If you were to enable the corporate identity, and we need to give it a caption, I keep forgetting that, then you can see that a default corporate identity has been enabled down here as well. And the same thing happens here. Even if I choose one here, if you have user default set to yes for the corporate identity, it will default to their corporate identity first. But if they don't have one, then it will default to the default for the document. If you have any questions about contact associations, then please email support@flexrentalsolutions.com or visit our forum and view the webinars board where you can find the webinar for this particular topic and you can discuss it further.